I'm going to actually continue some of the discussion that we began last week on the goodness of God and the problem of evil. And I'm aware that it's somewhat difficult and delicate to speak of such things in the light of recent events and what happened in Pittsburgh this past Saturday, which is there's always a danger of trivializing things here. I hope I avoid that. I have tried to incorporate some comparative reflections from the Jewish tradition. But I'm going to be talking about goodness and God in Hindu thought. And this is a project I've been dabbling in for some years. It, in fact, has emerged out of the recent polarization in our society and around the world. And the idea, I've been thinking about the idea that if one thinks of one's God as morally perfect and morally perfect in ways that one can readily understand, that could be very dangerous. It could indeed be the basis of polarization and fanaticism. So I've been looking for ways to sort of muddy the waters a little bit on that. And perhaps you can see this already in this great Hindu image of the god Shiva, who is dancing the universe. And Shiva, doing the cosmic dance of creation, is dancing the entire universe, therefore good and evil. So already there's a hint that conceptions of deity in the Hindu tradition may be somewhat different than at least popular Christian concepts of God. Although it must be pointed out that the view, well, I'll get to it. Emerson's rule. Thanks very much to Derek Cartwright. I don't know if you can see that, but Emerson's rule was that ideas of goodness must have some edge to them. And I found that inspiring. I think that was the first series in this series. So I'm going to try and do something edgy here. Greenberg's working principle is that no statement should be made that would not be credible in the presence of burning children. That was discussed last week, and thanks to Toby for reminding me of that one. And that, of course, is a solemn and difficult burden to carry, again, especially in the light of recent events. So I hope I do that moderately well. Here, Richard Dawkins is a modern, sort of one of the new atheists. And people who, there's much of them that are assiduously publishing and making money, proving God, the non-existence of God. And in his book, The God Delusion, he has an interesting statement which refers to the problem of evil, as discussed last week. It is childishly easy to overcome the problem of evil. Simply postulate a nasty God. Right? Because the argument from evil depends on the idea that God is sort of omnibenevolent. He means well and is always struggling to do the best for all of us with his omnipotent powers. So my question is, what's the deal here? Is God necessarily nice? What is the data? I do, in the paper I wrote, I dealt with Aquinas. I'm going to leave him out and focus on Hinduism. But what's the data from world religions? Is God uniformly conceived of as nice or not, at least not nasty? Notice here the assumption is that there are many kinds of goodness. There's metaphysical goodness, being. There's aesthetic goodness. There's functional, instrumental goodness. The assumption here with this argument is that God is morally good and that God can be judged by some similar standard to which we would use to judge our fellow human beings. And my basic thesis here is that idea is not supported by the data of world religions. Even in the Christian tradition, there's a great segment of opinion supporting the transcendence of God. God may be good, but not necessarily morally good in the same way that human beings might be so. But let's turn to Hinduism. And the first example, this is a theologian, 12th century Ramanuja. He was a follower of Vishnu, a Vaishnava. He taught a form of Vaishnava theology called qualified non-dualism. And he goes all in for God's goodness. God is absolutely perfect in every possible way, squeaky clean, pure, and super holy. All right? I'm just going to mention this to show you that it's in the tradition. Hinduism is a composite of multiple traditions. The word Hinduism is a Western label for multiple traditions, a kind of a basket in which we have put them into, and which they did not conceive of themselves as a single world religion until the late 19th century during the colonial period. So here's one example. I'm going to mention it and leave it. There are Hindu theologians that go for the good, and the notion that God is absolutely good, pure, and holy, and all that good stuff. Now we're going to shift. I'm going to look at two Hindu theologians from India, and then I'm going to make a short excursus to the island of Bali and look at Hinduism in Bali, their conceptions of the goodness of God. So here's Shankara, 7th century of the Common Era. He is a monk, a theologian, the founder of the Advaita Vedanta. Advaita means non-dualism, the idea that of complete and utter oneness of all things that can be reduced to one ultimate essence. A kind of a monism, to use a fairly good but not great Western philosophical term. Okay? So he's a monk. And that's not him. We don't know what he looked like, but there's an image of him. So his basic scriptures are called the Upanishads. He's working with those texts, and the first thing we discover in these highly philosophical texts they go back to the latest ones were composed maybe 500 BCE. The word satya, Brahman is satya. Satya can be translated as good. Okay? Purusha is a good person. A sadhu is a good monk. All related to this word satya. It can be translated as good, but in the Upanishads, it means being. It can mean good, it can mean being, it can be reality, it can mean truth. Here, it means being or truth or reality. Brahman is being, knowledge, infinite. So there's a very abstract conception of the deity. Brahman is the highest deity, but it's a very abstract conception. It's not an anthropomorphic deity. It's not like a person with personal qualities or attributes. Indeed, there's a profound tradition here of negative theology. The Upanishad says the self or the Brahman is spoken of as not this, not this. It's not long, it's not short, it's not perfect, it's not good. It's transcendent, utterly transcendent. It's beyond the opposites, dvandvatita, the Upanishads proclaim. It's beyond morality, immorality, what is desirable, what is undesirable, what is good, what is bad, good deeds, bad deeds, merit, and sin. important idea, that they really work on stressing the utter transcendence of Brahman. And as many scholars and commentators have, in English, have expressed, and Western scholars, it's really beyond good and evil. So one of the Upanishads proclaims there in Brahman, a thief is not a thief, the murderer of a Brahmin is not a murderer of a Brahmin. And let me tell you, in this culture, to murder a Brahmin, the high priest, is the worst sin. It's despicable. Okay? So here, in reference to this reality, moral categories do not apply. So Shankara, again, is the philosopher here of this tradition. He does offer a theodicy. It's basically, it was mentioned last time, the karma theodicy. It's not God's problem, it's your problem. You did the karma. Okay? Karma being the moral consequences of one's activity. And the metaphor here is that God is like rain. Rain falls equally and neutrally on all, but the rice seed sprouts as a rice plant, and the barley seed sprouts as a barley plant, and it's the seed's problem what it becomes and how it develops, not God's. Okay? Or not, I should say, not the rain. The rain is equal in all. God is equal. God gives being to all. It's our individual karma, our individual responsibility that creates our experience. So God's off the hook. So that's pretty conventional. It's the same theodicy that this other guy with a nice God, Ramanuja, posits. But this is only a preliminary theodicy. Shankara, he's slippery like Buddhists. He has a two-level theory of reality. There's a conventional reality in which we all live, which is kind of like an illusion. But I tell my students it's like the Matrix. You remember that? It's kind of this hyper-real, hyper-virtual reality projection. So this works in the conventional reality, in the lower level of reality in which we all live, but there's a paramartha, there's a supreme experience available to the enlightened. And there's a final transmoral transcendence. So basically, this is from Shankara's commentary on the Brahma Sutra. He says, you can fault Brahman. You cannot fault Brahman for not doing what is beneficial and not doing something that's harmful, because Brahman is eternally liberated. The idea that Brahman does anything is a product of false ignorance of spiritual unawareness, a distorted vision caused by this mysterious power called Maya. All dualistic engagements engendered by this ignorance are transcended through true knowledge. In that state, basically, there's no creation. Wherefore can there be any defects, such as God's failure to do what is beneficial? And then he takes it one step further. I found this quote, and I've never seen it isolated before, but I was kind of blown away. From the absolute perspective, samsara does not exist. Do you know that word? Have you heard that word? Samsara is this world, basically. The world of cyclical universe, cyclical reincarnation. It ain't here. Well, that's an easy way to solve the problem of evil, isn't it? It ain't here. It's only part of the matrix. So there's a kind of an acosmic, transcendent thing going on here. God is not exactly immoral, but transmoral. And I think we could make that distinction. So now we're shifting from this Vedanta tradition, which is the orthodox Brahminical tradition, up north to the beautiful state of Kashmir. And there's a wonderful tradition there called Kashmiri Shaivism, which some of you may have heard the word Tantra. They have a different view of the world. Shankara, the Brahmanical ascetic, his view of the world is acosmic, non-inclusive, I call it. Here is a cosmic monism. The world is included in the divine rather than excluded. And notice here, this great theologian, he's not given the recognition he deserves. He's a theologian and great aesthetician. He wrote about drama, poetry, and everything. A great yogan, a practitioner of yoga. And, folks, importantly, he was not a monk, which is a kind of a statement about his understanding of the world. And don't tell anyone he has a girlfriend. Okay. And you can see he's giving a discourse on sublime spiritual teachings, but his hand is delicately strumming a veena, a lute, and he's savoring the sensuosity, the sensualness of the sound there. So it's a different approach. And the supreme deity of Kashmir Shaivism is Bhairava. Indeed, Abhinavagupta, this philosopher, was regarded as a manifestation on earth of Bhairava. Bhairava means the terrifying. So here is an image of God that is not quite nice. Okay? Terrifying. Speaking of death and pain and suffering as well as divine power. And here's a quotation from one of the tantric texts, which is the basis of this tradition, describing Bhairava as the bestower of the experience of the terrifying samsara, the terrifying world. It's a very interesting quote. The experience is not, don't blame it on your karma. Your experience here, suffering or otherwise, is bestowed. He's the udatra, the bestower of these experiences. Bhairava grants the exceedingly terrible experiences in samsara. Not a nice God, or at least not conventionally nice. Ultimately, perhaps. Here's the image, another image of Bhairava. This is at the temple, a big temple in Kathmandu in Nepal. Lord, the prayer goes, by wearing bones and the rosary made of severed human hands and heads and shining with human blood, you instruct that the world is pure because it is of nature of Brahman. So here's the God with severed human hands, heads, and such. There's the heads. So again, a terrifying God that becomes an extraordinary object of meditation. An object of meditation that may not be tasteful to many. This is the religion of the tantric vira, the tantric hero, the one who boldly goes where others fear to go and seeks transcendence in the experience of the world in a radical acceptance and transformation of this world. Now, we're jumping again to Bali. And this is a wonderful passage that I read from Mark Hobart. I'm sure David knows his work. A neat guy. And he recounts the story of hanging. He lived in Bali for years, and he speaks the language, hung out in Balinese villages and such. And he recalls one night hanging out with Balinese villagers, talking late into the night about religious problems. And the Balinese were saying, our religion has a lot of perplexing things and contradictions in it. And the Balinese are very religious, but they also have a healthy dose of skepticism. Okay? So he says, the Balinese are saying we have many contradictions. And he says, well, we Westerners too, we have this big contradiction. It's called the problem of evil. If God is good, omnipotent, whence evil? And the reaction of the villagers is spectacular. I was met with hoots of laughter. White people seem so clever. How could they find difficult what was so obvious even to simple villagers who could not read or write? One of them explained to me, God, the highest all-embracing divinity, was bad, of course. How else could there be bad in the world? If the world comes from God, there's bad in the world. It's obvious. This is the Kala manifestation of Shiva with 10 heads and I don't know how many arms. But he is a fearsome deity related to Bhairava, called Padmurtian, a wrathful transformation of God. These are from the Kirta Ghosha. We took these photos with students from USC. Okay? So the idea that God can transform and appear in this wrathful form points to this idea I mentioned at the beginning, Shiva dancing the universe. The dance of the god includes the bad, or what we might call evil, as well as the good. Wendy Doniger, a well-known scholar of Hinduism from the University of Chicago, puts it pretty well here, although I wouldn't say generally all Hindus would accept this. In Hinduism, evil, like good, is an integral part of God and stems from him. This works for Kashmir Shaivism and other tantric schools. It works for Balinese Hinduism, which is an old form of South Indian Hinduism that was transported and reprocessed over the years in a long ways from home. Integral part of God. So the question then is, I'll end with this, why is there suffering? And this is one of the great spiritual teachers of the Advaita tradition, the non-dualist tradition in 20th century India, passed away around 1950. Yeah. Why is there suffering? So you will ask that question. If you go through life without asking questions, if it's all a party, there's no moral development. It's a version of what do they call it in Christian, the soul-making theodicy. Okay? Why is there suffering? Because we need to ask that question. Asking that question is the beginning of a spiritual life. If everything's cool, if you're on the beach at Maui, drinking pina coladas all day, no problems, no ripple in your onward flow of comfort and pleasure, who asks questions? Look at the lives of movie stars and rock stars. Okay. Now to get serious again. Night, Elie Wiesel, which Toby mentioned. There's a wonderful character in Elie Wiesel's Night. Right at the beginning, Elie Wiesel uses that to kind of frame this character to kind of frame the book. A guy named Moshe, the beadle. Beadle's a kind of a religious functionary in a synagogue. Okay. Man raises himself toward God by the questions he asks. I pray to God within me that he will give me the strength to ask him the right questions. So the idea in my thinking here is simply to suggest that we need to really complexify a concept of God. God is not squeaky clean, I could suggest to you. And there are some popular traditions and some sophisticated traditions that suggest that God is squeaky clean, but not all. Certainly not all, and I've tried to provide some evidence. I'm not trying to solve the problem of evil here. I'm just trying to suggest that the Hindu tradition and others would offer us some profound images to contemplate the mystery of suffering and serve as a platform for asking questions. Thank you.
The title of my talk is Confucius and the Impossibility of Goodness. And a central suggestion of my talk is that while there is a lot in Confucius that I think is going to be of interest to people who are exploring the idea of goodness, I don't think we should rush to the conclusion that there is anything really strongly comparable to the notion of goodness in Confucius. And hopefully I'll be able to make that a little clearer to you. Okay. Now, the title of my talk really owes a lot to François Jullien, the French sinologist and comparative philosopher. And he wrote this book, The Impossible Nude, in which he argues really very compellingly that the artistic genre of the nude, as we know it in, from traditional European art, could never have developed in China. It could never have developed as a part of traditional Chinese art. And the reason for that is because basically the philosophical and cultural commitments, metaphysical commitments in particular, were not present, and they haven't been present in traditional China. And this is very relevant to our topic today. But just to say a little bit more about Jullien, he argues that the metaphysical tradition of essentialism was not present and has not been present in China. And there are all different versions and kinds of essentialism. But just to speak generally for a moment, essentialism is the view that, everything has an essence or an intrinsically real nature to it. And that determines what something is. It determines its whatness. And in some cases, we might think of these essences as analogous to blueprints that articulate the form and the whatness of something even before it exists. Now, these essences may, as for a philosopher like Plato, take on the status of eternal ideas that are intelligible. We can understand them, but they're not sensible. They're not available to our senses. And Jullien sees the genre of the nude as actually an attempt to make an intelligible ideal, the essence or the ideal of human being, sensible. I would note here that Jullien's work does not sort of eclipse the social and political meanings of the nude. He's really just talking about the philosophical choices, the philosophical commitments that he thinks form really a necessary condition for the emergence of this genre of the nude. Now, in contrast to European art, traditional Chinese art and thought are not organized around notions of unchanging essences, intrinsically real forms, or archetypes. Rather, they're organized around change and process. Everything in this Chinese worldview is ceaselessly transforming and is relational. Nothing is what it is all in itself. Everything is sort of co-creating everything else. So there is no realm of unchanging or pre-given essences. There are no stable or intrinsically existing forms, period. And in China, the human body has largely been viewed from the viewpoint of energy, not anatomy. And it has not typically taken on the status of an object. Okay. And something I'd want to add here about Confucianism is that at least in the Confucianism of the Analects, where we get this portrait of Confucius himself, the body is really seen as a kind of an ongoing accomplishment. It's a locus of cultivation and refinement. It's never given as like just an object, a complete and final being. Okay, so So just very briefly again, Francois Jullien argues that the nude is an embodiment of a quest to reveal the essential or intelligible form through sensible form, whereas the Chinese did not conceive of any intelligible form beyond the realm of the sensible, nor any immutable form that is an essence. I can skip the rest of that. So now, let's see if we can move this. Yeah. So now we come to Henry Rosemont, Jr., who just passed away about a year ago. And like Jullien, Henry Rosemont also stresses the different thought choices that characterize Chinese and Anglo-European traditions. And he draws our attention to the concept clusters that underlie these very distinctive traditions and very distinctive discourses. Now, these clusters are not collections of terms, but they're organically related clusters of key terms and cultural ideas that generate their meaning together, and they function together to make a paradigmatic way of making sense. Now, according to Rosemont, when we look at the moral discourses of Anglo-European philosophy, their key terms find no close lexical equivalent in classical Chinese. And Rosemont would argue, along with Jullien, that the same can be said for terms of metaphysical discourses. And an important assumption that Rosemont makes, and one that I agree with, is that we cannot simply lift a term like goodness out of a concept cluster and the history that gives it meaning and expect it to retain its meaning or to find its equivalent elsewhere. So if we look, and I'm trained as a philosopher, so I've chosen philosophers that I think have been talked about here in this series. And so I thought we'd take a very quick look. We're not going to go through these in detail or anything. But if we look at a few concept clusters from some well-known Anglo-European philosophers, we find that notions of good and goodness often form part of a concept cluster that includes a notion of the human being as having a nature or an essence. You know, this notion of there being human nature. Many of us take that for granted, but we don't have human nature, say, in Confucius. That would be a very odd idea. Even for Mencius, who's often translated as if he has a notion of human nature, this would be an odd idea. So again, these concept clusters from Anglo-European philosophers rely in part or embody this notion of a human being as having a nature or essence. Often that nature or essence is articulated as rationality. And with this commitment to there being some kind of a human nature, there is this imperative to clarify and realize what is sort of the highest good or the highest end, given that human nature. Moreover, when metaphysics and epistemology are not separated from ethics, as in Plato, knowing the good as highest metaphysical reality is linked to being a just or good human being. Okay, in most cases, good is held as an intrinsically real thing. Okay, there's an essence of good. And also in modern and recent eras, we've got Kant from the modern era and J.S. Mill, John Stuart Mill from the 19th century. The concept cluster includes standards or rules or imperatives for realizing goodness of action or will or consequences. Okay. So while these concept clusters that I've just put up here a minute ago they're different, there's very much a family resemblance to them. They all embody some degree of essentialism, okay? And so questions that might arise from any of those concept clusters might show up in this way. What do the terms good and goodness signify? Or even more directly, what is good or what is goodness? Are some things intrinsically good? How do we know them to be so? What is the highest good for human beings given human nature? What sorts of goodnesses are there? How do they relate to moral goodness? What makes human actions or their consequences good? Is goodness a virtue, and how do we develop? So these are all questions that emerge out of the concept clusters that we find in Anglo-European philosophy. But if we look at the Confucian concept cluster, we get a very different story. It doesn't contain anything that we would really translate as good. When we consider the Confucian concept cluster, I would argue that we don't have anything strongly comparable to what we just saw with those Anglo-European clusters. There are no essences or natures, whether of human beings or of good. There are no intrinsically existing things. Everything is relationally constituted, as I said earlier. People are identified relationally, and human refinement is achieved through the sensitive and aesthetically successful living out of ritually constituted social roles. Now, with such a metaphysical and practical background, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that there's a choice to place a great deal of emphasis on harmony, or he, which is actually originally a culinary term that suggests a process of sort of, mutually enhancing the ingredients of any particular situation. Now, while Confucius is certainly concerned with human cultivation, with developing an exemplary Tao, or manner of conduct, I think we should think twice about rushing to the conclusion that this is a moral project, such as we find in the Western wisdom traditions, or that a term like goodness fits into it at all. If we use Western philosophical categories to characterize Confucius's project, it's arguably more fitting to call it an aesthetic vision, as has been argued by many people now, particularly Roger Ames, Henry Rosemont, but there are others as well. Confucius is concerned that people cultivate a refinement of sensibility and conduct that hits the mark of what is fitting or appropriate. And this is more of an aesthetic approach. The Ren person, or the person who's achieved consummate personhood or exemplary status, is one who is supremely attuned to human relationships and the possibilities of their unfolding in a harmonious, complex, and refined manner. He defers to others, not because it's good to defer, but because his deference kind of ripples out into a dance of deference in the community that creates harmonious relations. It does not respect the distinctiveness of Confucius's cultural and philosophical commitments to call the consummate or Ren person good. Now, there is a term that is sometimes translated as good, shan, but A.C. Graham, a wonderful scholar of Chinese philosophy, remarks it's not a prominent term in Chinese philosophy. It shouldn't be, according to others as well, should not be essentialized. Rosemont names translated as efficacious and adept. And the point of this is to emphasize that we can't simply find the nearest equivalent character for good or goodness. These terms belong to concept clusters that are very, very different and have very different histories and contexts. Now, just to maybe make this point a little stronger about this perhaps being more of an aesthetic vision than a moral one. Some of the terms that are used to describe the cultivated person and the uncultivated person, or the Junza, the exemplary person, and the Shaoren, the petty person. We have a lot of terms that are much more in line, again, with an aesthetic vision. You know, the cultivated person is elegant and eloquent, refined, attractive. Confucius talks about Emperor Shun, I believe, as being majestic and, you know, consummate and so on. Whereas the uncultivated person is unctuous and inappropriate. They're glib and not eloquent. And they're
No politics.
sometimes, yeah, none, boorish and officious. Yeah, a Confucian critique would be really delicious, wouldn't it?
I'm boorish.
Okay. One thing I wanted to point out about this is that these are not terms that would ever be defined in the abstract. They are read off of actual people. In other words, there's a huge difference between, say, Confucius and Plato, where Plato is always looking for the meanings of these very abstract terms like justice and good and so forth. But we don't have that kind of appeal to the abstract and disembodied. Confucius learns about elegance and cultivation and what the Ren person is like by reading it off of particular people who actually lived. And when he's generalizing and when it sounds like he's making some sort of general claim about how people should be, it's again not coming from an abstract understanding. He's reading that off of historical persons. Okay, so we have a very different set of questions that might arise in a Confucian inquiry. Very different from what we saw coming from those other concept clusters. You know, whose Tao, whose style, whose conduct is worthy of emulation? Is particular person X acting in a consummate way in this particular set of circumstances? Okay, why are, again, these particular persons exemplars or anti or bad examples? And sometimes Confucius's students would ask, who's more consummate, you know? Me, you know, Zulu or Renyo or somebody else. So again, it's very concrete. It's not abstract. Now I want to mention this notion or this use of exemplars in, bless you, in Confucius of the Analects. We have exemplars. Again, these are the cultural heroes, you know, including Confucius. Very often they're old sage kings. Sometimes the exemplars are, well, certainly Confucius himself is elevated to exemplar in the Analects. But so we have exemplars. What we don't have are moral rules or principles or any kind of moral calculus, okay? But we have this resource of the exemplars. And again, even when Confucius says something that sounds like an imperative, it sounds like some kind of a moral principle or something, he's not reporting a principle or he's not setting a rule. He's reporting on what has worked well for people. And he's reporting what has worked well for the exemplars, different exemplars. Okay, now a couple of additional things to add here. Confucius teaches and learns by narrative examples, okay, these exemplars again. And so it's a matter in this process of teaching and learning of resonating with the stories of those who have made sort of the most of the ingredients of their lives and who have cultivated relationships that are refined and satisfying, harmonious and reverential. In the Analects, there's a plurality of exemplars, including Confucius himself, his favorite exemplar, the Duke of Zhou, many ancient sage kings or legendary figures such as Tai Bo, who renounced his claim to the throne so that his younger brother's son, who was really brilliant, would be in the line of succession. Now, each of these exemplars is exemplary in his own way, in his own set of circumstances. And which one might be inspirational, which one might provide guidance to someone, really depends on a person's situation. So again, it's not a one-size-fits-all, it's not an abstract source of principles or anything like that. Stories of the exemplars cannot be translated into abstract formula, set of normative principle. For Confucius, life happens in the concrete, not in the abstract. Bad examples also abound in the Analects, such as a man named Yuan Rong, who was one of Confucius's students, and his relationships were in a continual state of disaster. There's also the Ji family, who they get a lot of time in the Analects because they put on these ostentatious ceremonies that are way out of line with their actual social position and their ancestral lineage. And there's also a man named Zai Wo. Oh yeah, it was Zai Wo who was actually the student of Confucius, but he never followed through on his word, and Confucius actually compares him to a wall of manure. Okay? He says you cannot trowel over a wall of manure. As for Zai Wo, he's not even worth upbraiding. Okay. So just a couple things as we close here. Confucius belonged and contributed to a very distinctive culture with its own values, commitments, and terminology. And while it's arguable that there is nothing strongly comparable to goodness in Confucius, there is much in the Confucian project that might be of interest to those inquiring about Greek-derived notions of goodness, which I assume has been what most of these conversations have been about. And I would suggest on this last point that, this notion of the exemplar would be very, very interesting to those of us who are interested in goodness. And with that, thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry I've missed the earlier presentations because I actually have a class right now. So I'm ditching class. I think maybe a couple of my students also ditching, but I wanted to be here with you and share a Buddhist perspective on the question of good and goodness. Of course, Buddhism is not a monolith. It has a history of about 2,500 years over a whole span of cultures and geography and languages. And in each place, it has met the indigenous culture, and it's been transformed in amazing ways, as we know. So it's, I guess, the best idea to start at the beginning, trace it back to the roots, and then later we could continue to suggest or explore what happens to it after that. what happens to these concepts when they go to China, when they go to Japan, when they go to Indonesia, and so on. Basically, Buddhism is all about goodness. It's all about being a good person, having a good heart. A good heart is a noble heart. A good heart brings happiness to oneself and others. So they don't shy away from a dualistic perception. We want to enhance the goodness in ourselves, encourage it in others, and shy away from what is harmful. So the Buddha's whole project is to eliminate suffering, to understand suffering, and then to try to work to overcome suffering, to eliminate suffering both in oneself, for oneself, and in the world. It's a huge project, but we do our best. And it doesn't always work out well. I mean, let's look at some of the problems. Now we hear about the Rohingya, this catastrophe in Burma, which has roots in colonialism, and it has roots in economic exploitation of the resources of our kind. But it's no excuses, right? The Buddha's supposed to be good little people, and what's going on? We could also look at Sri Lanka, 25-year civil war, which I believe set the stage for what's going on in Burma. If the international Buddhist community had spoken out against the atrocities to the Tamils, maybe they would not have sent the message that violent responses are acceptable, as we see now among a lot of people in Burma, a surprising number. And we could go back even further to the Second World War. Why did some Zen masters support the Nazis? And, the whole project of, it started out well with the Great East Asian Prosperity Sphere, but as we know, it went all downhill from there with the invasion of China and Southeast Asia and so on. So, if these people are Buddhists, then what went wrong? Well, the ideal is still there, to cultivate a good heart. And it's very, we cannot say that all Buddhists are good, of course, but that's the ideal, to try to strive for that, because everybody wants to be happy. Nobody wants to suffer. And so from the good heart come good actions. That is wholesome actions, skillful actions. And so it's all about the concept of karma, cause and effect, but the Buddha put a twist on it. He emphasized the intention behind the action, so that it's not just that we experience suffering because of something that we did bad in the past. We can generate wholesome actions, skillful actions in the present moment and going forward, right? That's, play it forward, right? This whole concept. So the idea of being wholesome kusala is opposed to akusala, which is, it's a basic dichotomy between the good and the bad. Originally, right? Now what goes on in China, let's say Japan, 2,000 years later, it's a different story. It goes in many interesting directions. We've talked about this before, right? So, but there is a moral calculus here. There are certain guidelines for human behavior that will ensure our own happiness and the welfare of others. And they have many, many different guidelines, different formulations of what's entailed in being good. Starting with the precepts not to kill, not to steal, not to lie, not to sleep with other people's partners, and so on. And then they include no intoxicants, because if we're stoned or drunk, we might break one of the other precepts. Right. So they do not really have a concept of evil. The Buddhists don't do evil. It's people make mistakes. But the human heart, actually, our heart, mind, they call consciousness. No soul, so we're not dealing with an eternal soul, but we're dealing with an impermanent stream of consciousness Okay, an impermanent stream of consciousness is mutable. It's malleable, right? So even if we have unkind impulses, we can do something about it. It's not intrinsic to human nature to be evil, to be mean, to be nasty. Are human beings mean and nasty? Yeah, we don't have to go far to see that. But we can do something about it, at least in our own heart, in our own mind, right? I know it sounds idealistic, but the Buddhists think it's worth trying for. To create a happy world where people can live together in peace and harmony. And in fact, I think some would say that the universe inclines toward the good because we're still here. But, okay, and in this process, right, we need good friends. We need encouragement. One person in the wilderness, it's very difficult to get the motivation and encouragement to meditate and, relinquish one's own welfare for the welfare of others. So we need good friends. So that's another point at which we find this word good coming up again and again. The idea of the Kalyana Mitra, to find good spiritual friends that encourage us. So important, I think, for your young people, but for everyone, to find people who encourage us to be the best we can be, to keep us on the path. And of course we're going to fall and make all kinds of mistakes. That's normal. But it doesn't mean that we cannot improve, right? There is no intrinsically evil person, including people that we think of as consummately evil. I mean, I go into Donovan to teach meditation, and these are lifers, they've done something really bad. Sometimes they tell us what they did. But they're so sweet. I mean, when you speak to them, almost all of them are sorry that they killed somebody. I mean, so the consciousness is impermanent. It's subject to change. And therefore, we can manage to understand our own ignorance, how we act out of ignorance. We think we're acting in our own benefit to get what we want, but in the end it backfires. So ignorance is the root of the whole problem, the human problem. And out of ignorance come all of the other delusions, the whole clusters of delusions, like the whole greed, desire, lust, attachment, family of emotions. And also the hatred, aversion, sort of anger, cluster of emotions. And then, of course, the ignorance, family of emotions with confusion and so on. So eventually they try to work through all of these. But the root of the problem is the essentialist notion that we are something permanent, essentially ongoing, and that, of course, sets off so many other problems, leading to attachment, greed, hatred, and all the rest of it. So it's a kind of deontological system where you do have two levels of truth, a conventional level of truth. It's not just illusion. We exist. We can pinch each other and find out. But so the Buddha was not, when he taught the concept of emptiness, he was not talking that a nihilist perspective. Things exist, but they don't exist the way we think they exist. You see, it's our ignorance that imagines that people are other than what they are. So to see the true nature of things then would be wisdom, and that's the goal. So wisdom and compassion are the main practices here in this system, based on ethical conduct. The ethical conduct is simply the foundations for all the rest of it. So, I completely forgot the watch. So Buddhists are so flaky, yeah. So just tell me when to stop. Yeah. So now, Buddhists also don't shy away from the concept of perfection. Again, it's idealistic, but hey, somebody's got to do it. So they put the Buddha up there as the ideal, the perfect human being, right? And, oops, it's male. Oh, yeah, we're working on that. Yeah, we got a whole movement going. Yeah, we're going to fix it. But it's not his fault, but in Indian society of that day, of course, the epitome was male. And so he consciously took that form. And so the idea of auspiciousness, that from being good and doing good, then everything will be auspicious in the world. So first, cultivating a good heart, a kind heart, a compassionate heart, a moral heart that doesn't want to harm anyone, right? Sometimes even at our own expense. There is one philosopher in the 7th century, Shantidevi, says, take the loss and give the victory to others. Take the loss and give the victory to others. So countercultural, yeah? For everyone, it's just like, But no, this turns the whole thing around, right? That in the end, and it's kind of Taoist in a way too, the higher you climb, the harder you fall, sort of concept. So the Buddha taught many practices, meditation practices, contemplative practices. First, stability of mind. Learn to concentrate. Because often the mistakes we make are simply that we're not paying attention. So there's a whole raft of practices to help us develop single-pointed concentration, to focus, right? And with that focus, we can do great things. But without that focus, we're all over the place, too scattered to really get much done in terms of spiritual development. Therefore, this practice of developing single-pointed concentration is fundamental, right? They call it calm abiding. So it's not neutral either. It's not just concentrating like a samurai who slices somebody up very mindfully. We were just watching a film in the class. They're good at it, Very mindful, yeah. But however, the consequences are not pleasant for the one that gets chopped up. Therefore, we have to also have the good intention. It would mean calm abiding. So stay calm, right? And they talk about the divine abodes. The Buddhists do recognize these 6 different realms of existence. And so the divine abodes are like the heavens, right? The heavenly realm, where everything is really great. It's very pleasant. It's fun. You don't have to work, no problems and everything. But you don't make much progress there, spiritually speaking. Because without the problems, how would we grow? How would we learn? So therefore, the Buddhists would say, even if someone is mean and nasty, that is an opportunity for us to develop those kinds of qualities that we want to be a good person, a kind person. Well, actually, that person is our best friend. Our enemy is our best friend. So the Dalai Lama often talks about Mao Zedong as having been his teacher. This is the person who killed 1.2 million of his fellow human beings, but he says, Mao Zedong is my teacher. And he tells the story of a monk who came to see him, who'd been in prison in Tibet for many years. And he asked the monk, did you ever lose your compassion? He said, yeah, I was afraid at one point that I would lose my compassion for my jailer. So that was the person who was torturing him, literally, was the object of his practice. If you can develop loving kindness and compassion for the one who harms you, then you can practice on anyone. So this, I think, might be the best takeaway of the Buddhists. And some may call it cheap moralism. I don't care. But if it helps, to create a happier society, I think it's worth a try. Heaven knows we need more kind people in the world. Just my opinion. But so, is my time on?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to address primarily to Dr. Nelson, but it's open to other people. And I'm kind of relating back to monotheism as you did, but in some sense, Eastern influence have done something. And I'm thinking, from what you said and what other people said, that the essential part, the most essential part, is about being, whether that's one's own being, or being in a broader metaphysical sense. In order for being to be, I kind of think that you have to provide clearing first, which is a kind of a negative space, so then in a sense that you could move into that space and produce being. So that's related to existence. And I was thinking, because last week I kind of said something of that sort. It is as if God left the world incomplete so that you could engage in the world and bring being into existence, right? So I wonder whether that kind of non-existence is a part of actually existence, the essential part, that in a sense the spiritual nature allows a clearing for it to engage in a deeper understanding of what existence is about.
Well, we could talk about that for quite a while. It's a very interesting question, sir. The Indian tradition is a little ambivalent on that. Many of the ancient texts speak of the ultimate being as sat and asat, being and non-being. But the later tradition is pretty focused on the sat. And they don't speak so much of, if you're thinking of perhaps evil or the bad as kind of a negative space that God hasn't filled, something like that. I don't see that concept in the Hindu tradition. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not. But the sat being is what allows everything to exist. In that sense, it's certainly good. The problem is that being allows what we would call evil to exist, as well as what we might want to label good.
But what I'm trying to get at is that if being is sort of this sort of realm what everything is, in a sense, an individual is allowed to come into this thing and find for himself good and evil. I'm thinking more in the poetic terms, like the emptiness allows you to unfold into it and fill it with something, rather than if you're already in something that's already filled, then there's no room.
Can you help me with that? I'm asking my colleagues for help with this. It sounds kind of Zen to me a little bit.
Well,
What do you-
it's easy to respond from Confucius' point of view because he avoided those kinds of questions.
Okay.
And I think the Buddha
Yeah, the
wanted to
Buddhists
cut
too.
through
Right.
the dualism there.
Right, well, and cut to use speculation, actually. And we're in a big mess here. We gotta do something, we gotta, time is ticking by, and we only have a certain number of years on this planet, and we gotta go for it, And in fact, that's why they don't even really take up the question of God or not God, because it doesn't change our situation. We gotta work something out here. So they would actually avoid speculation as well, to some extent, and then they go on for 2,500 years speculating.
Interesting question.
One last question. So I feel that like a lot of Eastern traditions kind of, like the tradition in themselves kind of is a conflict of with the discussion of like reason and logic, So I guess my question is for all of you guys, like what, in your opinion, is like the importance with Eastern traditions of having discussions like this? Because like in the sense of a lot of these religions, they kind of base their tradition around not talking about some of the things, you know what I'm saying?
I think that's an idea that people have. I think in all of these traditions, there's a huge respect on what we might call rational discussion. It may be a matter of a different emphasis, you know? There's a huge emphasis on clear thinking and, in some cases, real rigorous argumentation and so on. But there are also these other aspects of human beings, and there's, there are forms of inquiry, like meditative inquiry, for example, that maybe doesn't get emphasized so much in some of the, Anglo-European wisdom traditions.
Yeah.
That's my quick take.
I would say that there's a great respect for the importance of critical thinking and reason, but there's also a point of going beyond reason, critical thinking and reason, and
Yes.
transcending.
Yeah, I agree. I was just kind of like curious what your opinion is on the, like how you weigh like the importance of the two. Because I just feel like with Christianity, it's more common nowadays to hear like intellectual debates like this with people who may be like atheists or something, but I don't hear it coming from like the Hindu tradition as much, like at least in our country. That's why I was just kind of curious, because I agree, like I think it's important, but to me, like I don't hear that many people like debating with an atheist who comes from like an Eastern tradition or something.
Well, there's certainly a long history of debate in India in both the Hindu and the Buddhist traditions. I know that Dr. Tsomo is trained in traditional methods of debate. But I think I'm right in saying that there's an awareness at the same time that the debate doesn't get you to the end. The debate is to open up a space for contemplative awareness, and perhaps different from Western philosophy here, the question can be more important than the answer. You'll never get the answer. There is no answer. The point is the question, the koan, or the problem of evil. It's not a clever proof against the existence of God. It's something for profound and extended contemplation. And if it raises more questions than it answers, well, so be it.
That's a great place to leave.
Yeah. Yeah.